Today we're going to talk about MS, and the reason why I'm bringing up this topic is because I just saw yet another article about Christina Applegate, and not only her MS diagnosis, but her daughter Sadie's diagnosis of POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And some of those symptoms of POTS are very similar to MS. So, first off, I want to say welcome to my channel. My name is Sparrow Spaulding. I am a trauma recovery specialist, retired psychotherapist. I'm also a functional medicine nutritionist, which means that I help people with chronic disease. And because of my background as a psychotherapist, and I'm also a trauma survivor, I sort of morphed into the person who people come to when they have chronic disease and they've seen all the doctors and they can't get relief. So not only am I a person who creates meal plans and reads labs and helps people heal and sometimes reverse chronic disease, I also help them go into the emotional side of it, because often people who are struggling with chronic disease and illness are trauma survivors. And so I saw the link in myself many years ago, and I've seen the link over and over in my clients over the last 2 decades. So I feel like I'm pretty dialed in. So the first thing I want to say about MS and most autoimmune diseases is there seems to be this trauma connection. So if there's unresolved trauma or just ongoing trauma or dysfunction that happened in childhood, a lot of times if it's not dealt with in counseling, if it's not, processed and integrated, it will manifest as a physical symptom at some point. So, and it's my belief that just about every disease, not all, but just about all disease has an energetic or a mental health component to it. It just has been my experience in 2 decades, okay? So when I get a client with MS, and I've had many, the first thing I do is a full bio. I want to know all about that person's childhood. I want to know if there was abuse, what mom was like, what dad was like, was there drinking in the home, was school traumatic, did somebody die early on? I mean, on and on and on. I want to uncover every stone to see what's hidden. And the other thing is, I want to really figure out why this person's immune system is overactivated, okay? Because with autoimmune diseases, that's typically the case. And so what happens when you have symptoms of MS, a lot of times the doctors will run certain tests. It's really hard to pinpoint. Most autoimmune diseases are fairly hard to pinpoint. So a lot of times it's, I don't want to say a guess diagnosis, but to some degree. So they will look for lesions, they'll look for blood markers, maybe a seborrheic or a C-reactive protein, things like this to see if there's inflammation there, right? And they'll check to see if there's lesions on the brain or the spinal cord. There's different tests that they can do, but there's really not one gold standard test for MS. Same with rheumatoid arthritis. We have some blood markers, we have some things that we can test, but, is there a gold standard? Not really. When I'm looking at a patient who has an overactive immune system, we want to figure out why, right? And there can be a number of reasons. Is it chronic stress? Is it a food sensitivity? Is it a gut issue? Is it a sleep issue? There could be so many things. Is this person exposed to a toxin or numerous toxins? On and on and on. And everybody's a little bit different. So, when I get a new patient in, it's like this person is an individualized snowflake. There's never a one size fits all, because even though they might have the same disease as so-and-so over here, the pathway to get there is very individualized. So that being said, a lot of times when people go and get a diagnosis, the first thing they're told is, oh, this can't be cured. You can go into remission, but, then you could have a flare-up. So they tell the person right away, this can't be cured, which that, really just programs the person to fully accept the diagnosis. There's no cure for this, so now it's going to have to become part of my identity, which I don't agree with. And, a person really changes when that happens. Now, I want to give you a statistic here. There's 7.4 million incorrect diagnoses per year. That is a lot. And out of the 7.4, 2.6 million people receive a harm that could have been prevented as a result of that diagnosis. And 370,000 people each year are permanently disabled or die from the misdiagnosis. Do you realize how major that is? That's way more than people die of drug overdose. I think the latest statistic for that is like 80,000 per year. 370,000. And that is why years ago, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a study that said doctors and hospitals are the third leading cause of death in this country. That is scary. And by the way, they retested that, I think, a decade later, and it was still true. So, if we get a diagnosis of MS tomorrow, God forbid, do we want to make that part of our identity? Absolutely not. But a lot of times what doctors do is they give you a pill, they say get a cane, and this is your new normal. I beg to differ. And the reason I say that is because I haven't had a single client yet that hasn't had a remarkable improvement of their symptoms. I have to be careful not to say recovery, right? But a lot of times, these are people who can go on to live a very normal, pain-free life because they had to make some changes. And they had to deal with maybe some unhealed trauma. And so that's why the medical community just fails people at such a sad, alarming rate. And I want you to keep that number in your head. 370,000 people per year have die or get a serious disability from a misdiagnosis. Now, I'm not saying that all people who are diagnosed with MS are misdiagnosed. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is there's gross negligence in the medical community. Okay. Now, here's another thing that we really need to think about, another statistic. People with Epstein Barr virus are 32 times more likely to go on to develop MS. What? That's crazy. If you get online, the peer-reviewed research on that is there. Why aren't more doctors talking about this? Why aren't we figuring this out? And by the way, there was no other association found between MS and any other virus. It's Epstein Barr. Now, are we familiar with Epstein Barr? It's the virus that causes mono. Many of us get exposed to it. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was over 95% by the time we reach adulthood have had some sort of exposure to Epstein Barr. Epstein Barr is in the herpes family. It's related to chickenpox. It's related to the herpes virus. It stays in our system, right? Just like those viruses. You know how chickenpox later on comes back out as shingles when the immune system is depressed, right? So, we have to figure out what's going on with immunity. So, the number one thing when people come in and they have an autoimmune disease, right? I go, okay, why is your immune system overfunctioning? Well, could it be because it's trying to fight this Epstein Barr? Is that a possibility? I think it's a real possibility. And so one of the things that I do with my patients is I put them on supplements and change their diet to lower viral loads of things like Epstein Barr and to raise their good immunity so that they can actually fight. And that's a lot of times mushroom extracts for things like B cells and helper T cells or natural killer cells to, increase those things so that you can fight a virus like Epstein Barr effectively. Okay. So if you have a virus like Epstein Barr living in your system, relatively undetected for a long period of time until it starts to do real damage like MS, then we have to ask ourselves what's happening to our immunity, right? Well, there's so many things that go on just in everyday life that depress our immunity. Lack of sleep, bad diet, chemicals in the water, the air, the food, preservatives, stress, emotional stress, physical stress, unresolved trauma. There's all kinds of things at work all the time attempting to lower our immune function. So if you get colds frequently, if you get flus, low vitamin D levels, that can be another one, right? So these are things that a qualified practitioner would really take a look at. And if you're not seeing somebody in the functional medicine world, you're really missing out, because otherwise you're just going to be treated like a number most likely, and you're going to be given a standard protocol. And a lot of the standard protocols for treating MS and other autoimmune diseases actually lower the immune system so much that then you can get strange exotic infections, and even cancers. And that is just not okay. That, in my opinion, that's not an ideal way to deal with an autoimmune disease. We have to dial it in. We have to figure it out. So by the time somebody has an autoimmune disease, they are in a firestorm of cytokines and inflammatory response. So a lot of times then, in order to put out that fire, you got to break out the big guns, right? So people say, well, I don't want to give up all of my favorite foods. Well, do you want to feel better? I don't want to go to bed at 10 o'clock every night. All right, but do you want to feel better? I don't want to take, 6 supplements a day. All right, but do you want to feel better? Because, our mentality these days is, all right, just pop a pill and hope for the best. And as we can see, that's not working. I mean, if we look at Christina Applegate, God bless her, and I've loved her for decades. She was such a great actress on so many different shows. Great fun. And I think she was in several movies too. The one that my husband and I always reference, I think it was called Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. Oh, we love that movie. Anyway, this poor woman now is, I read an article where she said life is a chore. She's not happy. She didn't come out and say like she's waiting to die, but kind of alluded to that. She's gained some weight, which is probably a result of her medications. She's walking with a cane. She is a shell of her former self. And as somebody who's in her early 50s, in my humble opinion, there's no reason she should be living like this. I don't know what all she's exhausted, but I can't say I promise, but I know we could find her some improvement, maybe even a lot of improvement in her day-to-day life. But she's going down that traditional medical path, and I'm really scared for how that's going to turn out for her. Here's where it gets even more dicey. So her daughter, who's 13 years old, has now been diagnosed with POTS. And, there is some research that's showing POTS can be the result of some medical interventions. I won't say which ones here, but you can probably figure it out. Some recent medical interventions that have taken place, in the last couple years. And I'm sure there's other reasons too. However, the thing that I'm most concerned about at this point is her daughter's 13. Her mom's been going through this for several years now. So right in her daughter's most formative years, her mom is sick, and her mom is really identifying with having MS and being sick. And she's mad. I think she recently said that she's really pissed about it, which who could blame her, of course. However, what I ask her or anyone else with MS to do is say, okay, be as pissed as you want to be, but then get curious. Get really curious. What is causing this? There is a cause, I promise you. There is a root to this disease, and I believe we could find it. But here's her daughter in her formative years, now also sick. So you have to wonder on a subconscious level, is she, developing symptoms out of solidarity? Maybe she feels bad for mom. Maybe out of love, she's like, okay, mom, I'm going to suffer along with you. And by the way, there's a book written about this I think it's called The Orders of Love by Bert Hellinger. life-changing book. It's all about ancestral patterns and family patterns and, just how we repeat things from our loved ones, our tribe, right? And how to break those patterns. However, so I'm really curious and concerned about this daughter who maybe doesn't feel like, your mom when you're growing up is your biggest role model. So if your mom is sick, what's to say that subconsciously you're not going to develop an illness to be like mom? Now, I'm not saying this stuff happens at a conscious level. It does not. Nobody sits around and says, okay, I'm going to develop an illness, to be like my mom. Nobody says that. But we have to remember about 80+% of human behavior is subconscious. Some people say up to 90%. I think Freud kind of said about 80%. But 80%, that's the majority of what we do in a day, is unconscious behavior. And so I always feel like, it's part of my mission to help make the unconscious conscious. So if you have MS, here is what I recommend to you. Do a deep dive. First off, write a bio about your life. And if you don't know where to start, my book Uncaged is a book and a workbook. In the very beginning, I have you write a bio and I have you detail out all the questions that I want you to answer and how to look for the patterns and how to look for, the things that went on in the early part of your life that are affecting you now. It's so important to do because, again, if you're struggling with autoimmunity, 99% of the time you're going to have trauma, unresolved, unprocessed. Now, you might have gone to counseling and you might have said, well, no, I worked through my trauma. Well, you may have here, but maybe your body didn't fully work through it. And the body, remember, keeps the score. And I'm also going to say this, the body pays the price. Okay. And so you might have worked through your dog passing away when you were 5 years old, right? But that sadness, that energy might have lodged itself in your knee or in your lower back or somewhere in your cells to where you might still be running that sadness and you don't even know. Now, this is just scratching the surface. When I work with people, we really go down the rabbit hole. So that's where I would start with Uncaged, writing your bio. I would look for a functional medicine practitioner. I am taking clients again, so click the link below and you can get more information on that. And if you want to work with me, if you're called to, I'd be happy to look at your situation to see if I can possibly help. But more importantly, you've got to take control of your health. Your health should not be in your doctor's hands. It should be in your hands. So I hope this was helpful. If it was, please click below, like and subscribe. As always, hug yourself from me. And just remember, it's so important to get to the root cause of illness. See you next time.